Okay, I'll go ahead and take my glasses off because I don't need them now because I'm not looking at a screen far away. Wow, it's been a huge day for me. Not it's been one of those days. It's been like a huge day, but nothing has happened because I've spent hours trying to make things work and nothing has happened. But at least the YouTube stream works again. That's exciting. I'm using my husband's computer. It's our computer, I suppose, since my computer got lost in the bath. Well, not lost. It's sitting right in front of me, but it's just a black brick at this point because I took it in the bath with me, which is very silly. But, I'm a very silly person. Anyway, I've been up for a few hours trying to make it stream games on Twitch because I wanted to do that. And we finally came to the conclusion that this computer just isn't going to live stream games. There's just we updated drivers, we looked at the NVIDIA graphics. It was an intense ordeal. Yeah, but you know what? I'm getting practice for Lara Croft, and we're getting another computer is coming on the 13th. So we'll see if that works. I don't know. It'll be a thing. If not, then we'll just wait because we have a desktop, but it doesn't work because of a reason, and we're not sure why, and we were in the process of figuring out why the desktop computer that we're building from scratch isn't working when everything in the world went a little bit crazy, like it does. And my mops are in my... Oh, there. That's a little... Whatever. No, I'm going to fiddle with it now. Oh, no. All right, I'll just let it be. Anyway, I'm waiting for my cup of tea. It should arrive here shortly. I've made brioche buns today. They don't look particularly beautiful, but I really don't bake for beauty. I bake because it's nice to knead something for extended periods of time, because it really works out that aggression. So I made some bread, and we're gonna have hamburgers, and my tea is coming, and then we can start, because I can't start without my cup of tea, because then the title wouldn't make sense.
It's pretty full, careful.
It's a pretty full tea.
It's pretty hot.
It's pretty hot. You're pretty hot.
Yeah.
That's my husband, who will remain off screen for modesty's sake. He's a good house husband. Cool. So now I have my tea and it's brewing. We'll talk about what I'm reading, which is The Phantom Tollbooth. And if you've watched the previous ones, I'm sorry, because they've probably devolved about halfway through. But Milo is a boy who was in a heavy depression, but a magical bright purple toll booth was delivered to his room, and for lack of anything better to do, he drove through it and entered into this wonderful magical realm. We've met several characters, like the weatherman who tells you whether or not there will be weather. We have met Faintly Macabre, who was a witch, and she chose which words were to be used. But she was imprisoned because she used the words, she got more miserly with the words. And one of the reasons that this whole world is topsy-turvy is that two princesses, Rhyme and Reason, have been put in a castle in the air far, far away. Because their brothers, King Azaz the Unabridged and the Math Magician, were unhappy that they counseled them to stop fighting. But Milo has decided that he's going to free the witches, not the witches, Rhyme and Reason, the two princesses. So he, along with his two companions, a humbug, who is a bug with that's just trying his best, to be quite frank. He's just trying his best. And also Talk, a watchdog. That's a dog with a watch for a body in the middle. And he goes tick, tick, tick instead of talk, talk, talk. And it's very tragic, but we love him anyway for it. And you just recently met a character. I dropped my bookmark on the floor. We just recently met a character called Alex Bings, and he thinks about things. And I always call him Alex because that's my husband's name, and his name is not Alex, it is Alec. But Alec Bings, his head is as tall as he's going to be. Thank you. And his feet go downward towards the ground. And he's constantly crashing into trees because he's going too fast. And he's always looking at the next thing, not the thing that's right in front of him, which I also identify with. There's a very big reason why I love this book. But he is in a forest, and he just encountered a man that, a perfectly average man who decided to become an everyman, because when you're utterly average, what else is left for you? And that's what this guy did. And then we just found, we started walking through the forest. So this is where I'm going to pick it up, right? They've just left the giant's place. And Alec Bings says, "I hope you're satisfied," when they returned from the house, and he bounced to his feet, bent down to awaken the snoring humbug, and started off more slowly this time in the direction of a large clearing. "Do many people live here in the forest?" asked Milo as they trotted along together. "Oh yes, they live in a wonderful city called Reality," he announced, smashing into one of the smaller trees and sending a cascade of nuts and leaves to the ground. "It's right this way." In a few more steps, the forest opened before them, and off to the left, a magnificent metropolis appeared. The rooftops shone like mirrors, the walls glistened with thousands of precious stones, and the broad avenues were paved in silver. "Is that it?" shouted Milo, running toward the shining city. "Oh no, that's only illusions," said Alec. "The real city is over there." "What are illusions?" asked Milo, for it was the loveliest city he had ever seen. "Illusions," explained Alec, "are like mirages." And realizing that this didn't help much, he continued. "And mirages are things that aren't really there and that you can't really see very clearly." "How can you see something that isn't there yet?" yawned the humbug, who wasn't fully awake yet. Oh boy, I'm just glistening, glowing. Hold on. Hey, there we go. That's a little better. I was a vampire for a second. A Stephanie Meyer's vampire. How can you see something that isn't there? Yawned the humbug, who wasn't fully awake yet. I empathize with that. Oh, also my throat is dry already. So take a sip of tea. "Sometimes it's much simpler than seeing things that are," he said. "For instance, if something is there, you can only see it with your eyes open. But if it isn't there, you can see it just as well with your eyes closed. That's why imaginary things are often easier to see than real ones." "Then where is reality?" barked Talk. "Right here," cried Alec, waving his arms. "You're standing in the middle of Main Street." They looked around very carefully. Talk sniffed suspiciously at the wind, and the humbug gingerly stabbed his cane in the air, but there was nothing at all to see. "It's really a very pleasant city," said Alec, as he strolled down the street, pointing out several of the sights, which didn't seem to be there, and tipping his cap to the passers-by. There were great crowds of people rushing along with their heads down, and they all appeared to know exactly where they were going as they darted down and around the non-existent streets and in and out of the missing buildings. "I don't see any city," said Milo very softly. "Neither do they," Alec remarked sadly, "but it hardly matters, for they don't miss it at all." "It must be very difficult to live in a city you can't see," Milo insisted, jumping aside as a line of cars and trucks went by. "Not at all, once you get used to it," said Alec, "but let me tell you how it happened. And as they strolled along the bustling and busy avenue, he began. Many years ago, on this very spot, there was a beautiful city of fine houses and inviting spaces, and no one who ever lived there was ever in a hurry. The streets were full of wonderful things to see, and the people would often stop and look at them. Didn't they have any place to go? Asked Milo. To be sure, continued Alec, but, as you know, the most important reason for going from one place to another is to see what's in between, and they took great pleasure in doing just that. Then, one day, someone discovered that if you walked as fast as possible and looked at nothing but your shoes, you would arrive at your destination much more quickly. Soon, everyone was doing it. They all rushed down the avenue and hurried along the boulevard, seeing nothing of the wonders and beauties of the city as they went. Milo remembered the many times he'd done the very same thing, and as hard as he tried, there were even things on his own street he couldn't remember. No one paid any attention to how things looked, and as they moved faster and faster, everything grew uglier and dirtier, and at last a very strange thing began to happen. Because nobody cared, the city slowly began to disappear. Day by day, the buildings grew fainter and fainter, and the streets faded away until it was at last entirely invisible. There was nothing to see at all. What did they do? The humbug inquired, suddenly taking an interest in things. Nothing at all, continued Alec. They went right on living here just as they'd always done. In the houses they could no longer see, and on the streets which had vanished, because nobody had noticed a thing. And that's the way they have lived to this very day. Hasn't anyone told them? Asked Milo. It doesn't do any good, Alec replied. For if they can never see what they're in too much of a hurry to look for. And I can't read what I'm in too much of a hurry to see. Oh. I always have that problem. Breathe. Why don't they live in illusions? Suggested the humbug. It's much prettier. Most of them do, he answered, walking in the direction of the forest once again. But it's just as bad to live in a place where what you don't see isn't there, as it is to live in one where what you don't see is. Perhaps someday you can have one city as easy to see as illusions, and as hard to forget as reality, Milo remarked. That will only happen when you bring back rhyme and reason, said Alec, smiling, for he had seen right through Milo's plans. Now, let's hurry, or we'll miss the evening's concert. They followed him quickly up a flight of stairs, which couldn't be seen, and through a door which didn't exist. In a moment they had left reality, which is sometimes a hard thing to tell, and stood in a completely different part of the forest. The sun was dropping slowly from sight, and stripes of purple and orange and crimson and gold piled themselves on top of the distant hills. The last shafts of light waited patiently for a flight of wrens to find their way home, and a group of anxious stars had already taken their places. Here we are, cried Alec, and with a sweep of his arm he pointed toward an enormous symphony orchestra. Isn't it a grand sight? There were at least 1,000 musicians ranged in a great arc before them. To the left and right were the violins and cellos, whose bows moved in great waves, whose bows... those bows. And behind them, in numberless profusion, the piccolos, flutes, clarinets, oboes, bassoons, horns, trumpets, trombones, and tubas were all playing at once. At the very rear, so far away that they could hardly be seen, were the percussion instruments, and lastly, in a long line up one side of a steep slope, were the solemn bass fiddles. Bass. Solemn bass fiddles. On a high podium in front stood the conductor, a tall, gaunt man with dark, deep-set eyes and a thin mouth placed carelessly between his long, pointed nose and his long, pointed chin. He used no baton, but conducted with large, sweeping movements, which seemed to start at his toes and work his way up through his body and along his slender arms, and finally end at the tips of his graceful fingers. I don't hear any music, said Milo. That's right, said Alex. You don't listen to this concert. You watch it. Now pay attention. As the conductor waved his arms, he molded the air like handfuls of soft clay, and the musicians carefully followed his every direction. "What are they playing?" asked Talk, looking up inquisitively at Alex. "The sunset, of course. They play it every evening, about this time." "They do?" Milo asked, quizzically. "Naturally," answered Alec. "And they also play morning, noon, and night. When, of course, it's morning, noon, or night. Why, there wouldn't be any color in the world unless they played it. Each instrument plays..." Oh, here, as you can see, that is the great orchestra that plays the sky, which I think is so lovely. Such a lovely idea. "Each instrument plays a different one," he explained, "and depending on, of course, on what season it is and how the weather's to be, the conductor chooses his score and directs the day. But watch, the sun has almost set, and in a moment you can ask Chroma himself." The last colors slowly faded from the western sky, and as they did, one by one the instruments stopped, until only the bass fiddles in their somber, slow movements were left to play the night, and a single set of silver bells brightened the constellations. The conductor let his arms fall limply at his side and stood quite still as darkness claimed the forest. "That was a very beautiful sunset," said Milo, walking to the podium. "It should be," was the reply. "We've been practicing since the world began." And reaching down, the speaker picked Milo off the ground and set him on the music stand. "I am Chroma the Great," he continued, gesturing broadly with his hands, "conductor of color, meister of pigment, and director of the entire spectrum." "Do you play all day long?" asked Milo when he had introduced himself. "Ah, yes, all day, every day," he sang out, then pirouetted gracefully around the platform. "I rest only at night. Even then, they play on." "What would happen if you stopped?" asked Milo, who didn't quite believe color happened that way. "See for yourself!" roared Chroma, and he raised both his hands high over his head. Immediately, the instruments that were playing stopped, and all at once the color vanished. The world looked like an enormous coloring book that had never been used. Everything appeared in simple black outlines, and it looked as if someone with a set of paints the size of a house and a brush as wide could stay happily occupied for years. Then Chroma lowered his arms. The instruments began again, and the color returned. "You see what a dull place the world would be without color," he said, bowing until his chin almost touched the ground. "But what pleasure to lead my violins in a serenade of spring green, or hear my trumpets blare out the blue sea, and then watch the oboes tint it all in warm yellow sunshine. And rainbows, best of all, and blazing neon signs, and taxicabs with stripes, and the soft, muted tones of a foggy day. We play them all." As Chroma spoke, Milo sat with his eyes open wide, and Alec and Talk and the humbug looked on in wonder. "Now, I really must get some sleep," Chroma yawned. "We've had lightning, fireworks, and parades for the last few nights. I've had to be up to conduct them, but tonight is sure to be quiet. Be a good fellow and watch my orchestra till morning, will you? And be sure to wake me up at 5:23 for the sunrise. Good night, good night, good night." With that, he leaped lightly from the podium and in 3 long steps vanished into the forest. "That's a good idea," said Talk, making himself comfortable in the grass as the bug rumbled himself quickly to sleep and Alec stretched out in midair. And Milo, full of thoughts and questions, curled up on the pages of tomorrow's music and eagerly awaited the dawn. Yay! It's taken about 10 days to close that chapter. Ooh, that feels good. How's everyone doing? Oh. Yeah, that's getting on. You can always tell when the ginger's getting a little bit better, you know? All right. Chapter 11. Oh my god, we're making progress. Discord and Din.
One by one, the hours passed, and at exactly 5:22, by Talk's very accurate clock, Milo carefully opened one eye, and in a moment the other. Everything was still purple, dark blue, and black, yet scarcely a minute remained to the long, quiet night. He stretched lazily, rubbed his eyelids, scratched his head, and shivered once as greeting to the early morning mist. "I must wake Chroma for the sunrise," he said softly. Then he suddenly wondered what it would be like to lead the orchestra and to color the whole world for himself. The idea whirled through his thoughts until he quickly decided that since it couldn't be very difficult, and since they probably all know what to do by themselves anyway, and since it did seem a shame to wake anyone so early, and since it might be his only chance to try, and since the musicians were already poised and ready, he would. But just for a little while. There's Milo getting ready to conduct. Oh. And so, as everyone slept peacefully on, Milo stood on tiptoes, raised his arms slowly in front of him, and made the slightest movement possible with the index of his right hand. It was now 5:23 a.m. As if understanding his signal perfectly, a single piccolo played a single note, and off in the east, a solitary shaft of cool lemon light flicked across the sky. Milo smiled happily, and then cautiously cricked his finger again. This time, 2 more piccolos and a flute joined in, and 3 more rays of light danced lightly into view. Then, with both hands, he made a great circular sweep in the air, and watched with delight as all the musicians began to play at once. The cellos made the hills glow red, and the leaves and grass were tipped with a soft pale green as the violins began their song. Only the bass fiddles rested as the entire orchestra washed the forest in color. Milo was overjoyed because they were all playing for him, and just the way they should be. "Won't Chroma be surprised?" he thought, signaling to the musicians to stop. "I'll wake him now." But instead of stopping, they continued to play, even louder than before, until each color became more brilliant than he thought possible. Milo shielded his eyes with one hand and waved desperately with the other, but the colors continued to grow brighter and brighter and brighter until an even more curious thing began to happen. As Milo frantically conducted, the sky changed slowly from blue to tan, then to a rich magenta red. Flurries of light green snow began to fall, and the leaves on the trees and bushes turned a vivid orange. All the flowers suddenly appeared black. The gray rocks became a lovely soft chartreuse, and even peacefully sleeping Talk changed from brown to a magnificent ultramarine. Nothing was the color it should have been, and yet the more he tried to straighten things out, the worse they became. "I wish I hadn't started," he thought unhappily, as a pale blue blackbird flew by. "There doesn't seem to be any way to try and stop them. Oh, dear. There he is, struggling against the light. Oh, dear." He tried very hard to do everything just the way Chroma had done, but nothing worked. The musicians played on, faster and faster, and the purple sun raced quickly across the sky. In less than a minute, it had set once more in the west, and then, without any pause, risen again in the east. The sky was now quite yellow, and the grass a charming shade of lavender. 7 times the sun rose and almost as quickly disappeared as the colors kept changing. In just a few minutes, a whole week had gone by. At last the exhausted Milo, afraid to call for help and on the verge of tears, dropped his hands to his sides. The orchestra stopped. The colors disappeared, and once again it was night. The time was 5:27 a.m. "Wake up, everyone! Time for sunrise!" he shouted with relief, and quickly jumped from the music stand. "What a marvelous rest!" said Chroma, striding to the podium. "I feel as though I'd slept for a week. My, I see we're a little late this morning. I'll have to cut my lunch hour short by 4 minutes." He tapped for attention, and this time the dawn proceeded perfectly. "You did a fine job," he said, patting Milo on the head. "Someday I'll let you conduct the orchestra yourself." Talk wagged his tail proudly, but Milo didn't say a word. And to this day, no one knows of the lost week, But the few people who happen to be awake at 5:23 no one knows of the lost week but the few people who happen to be awake at 5:23 on that very strange morning.
Ha. Oh, boy.
I've been wanting to read that part out loud for about, let's see, how long has it been since I've had a regular stream up that functioned? I think maybe like a week or more. And so it's just been like sitting in my brain half finished, and then finally finished. And boy, do I feel a sense of relief. I hope you all do too. Anyway, we'd better be getting along, said Tuck, who is very sensible. And his alarm had begun to ring again. For there's still a very long way to go, he continued. Chroma nodded a fond goodbye as they all started back through the forest. And in honor of the visit he made all the wildflowers bloom in a breathtaking display. I'm sorry you can't stay much longer, said Alec sadly. There's so much more to see in the Forest of Sight, but I suppose there's a lot to see everywhere, if you only keep your eyes open. They walked for a while, all silent with their thoughts, until they reached the car, and Alec drew a fine telescope from his shirt and handed it to Milo. And I will lower the blinds once again, so I stop glowing like a fairy. Now I'm just lit from below, so I'm glowing, and I think that's okay. Yes, Alec handed a fine telescope from his shirt and handed it to Milo. Carry this with you on your journey, he said softly, for there is much worth noticing that often escapes the eye. Though you can see everything from the tender moss in a sidewalk crack to the glow of the farthest star. I'm not going to curse. Instead, I'm going to start again and breathe and get focused. Alec is handing Milo a fine telescope. Carry this with you on your journey, he said softly, for there is much worth noticing that often escapes the eye. Through it, you can see everything from the tender moss in a sidewalk crack to the glow of the farthest star. And, most important of all, you can see things as they really are, not just as they seem to be. It's my gift to you. Milo placed the telescope carefully in the glove compartment and reached up to shake Alec by the hand. Then he stepped on the starter, and with his head full of strange new thoughts, drove out to the far end of the forest. The easy, rolling countryside now stretched before them in a series of dips and rises that leaped up one side of each crest and slid gently down the other in a way that made stomach laugh and faces frown. As they toppled the brow of the highest hill, a deep valley appeared ahead. The road, finally making up its mind, plummeted down, as if anxious to renew acquaintance with the sparkling blue stream that flowed below. When they reached the floor of the valley, the wind grew stronger, as if it funneled through the rocks, and directly ahead, a bright-colored speck grew larger and larger. Pardon me. I'll have another sip. Oh. Yum. It looks like a wagon, cried Milo excitedly. It is a wagon. A carnival wagon, seconded Talk. And that's exactly what it was. Parked at the side of the road, painted bright red, and looking quite deserted. On its side, in enormous white letters, bordered in black, was the inscription, Cacophonous a Discord. And below, in slightly smaller black letters, bordered in white, was Doctor of Dissonance. And here, because this is typo something, you can see Cacophonous a Discord and Doctor of Dissonance. Cacophonous. Perhaps if someone's at home, he might tell us how far we have to go, said Milo, parking next to the wagon. He tiptoed timidly up the 3 wooden steps to the door, tapped lightly, and leapt back in fright, for the moment he knocked there was a terrible crash from inside the wagon that sounded as if a whole set of dishes had been dropped from the ceiling onto a hard stone floor. At the same time, the door flew open, and from the dark interior, a hoarse voice inquired, "Have you ever heard a whole set of dishes drop from the ceiling onto a hard stone floor?" Milo, who had tumbled back off the steps, sat up quickly, while Talk and the Humbug rushed from the car to see what had happened. "Well, have you?" insisted the voice, which was so raspy that it made you want to clear your own throat. "Not until just now," replied Milo, getting to his feet. "Ha! I thought not," said the voice happily. "Have you ever heard an ant wearing fur slippers walk across a thick wool carpet?" And before they could answer, he went on in his strange, croaking way. "Well, don't just stand there in the cold. Come in, come in. It's lucky you happened by. None of you look well." The faint glow of a ceiling lamp dimly illuminated the wagon as they cautiously stepped inside. Talk first, eager to defend against all dangers. Milo next, frightened but curious, and the Humbug last, ready at any moment to run for his life. "That's right. Now let's have a look at you," he said. Very bad, a serious case." And this is who they see. The dusty wagon was lined with shelves, full of curious boxes and jars of a kind found in old apothecary shops. It looked as though it hadn't been swept out in years. Bits and pieces of equipment lay strewn all over the floor, and the rear was a heavy wooden table covered with books, bottles, and bric-a-brac. "Have you ever heard a blindfolded octopus unwrap a cellophane-covered bathtub?" he inquired again, as the air was filled with a loud, crinkling, snapping sound. Sitting at the table, busily mixing and measuring, was the man who had invited them in. He was wearing a long white coat with a stethoscope around his neck and a small round mirror attached to his forehead, and the only really noticeable things about him were his tiny mustache and his enormous ears, each of which was as fully as large as his head. "Are you a doctor?" asked Milo, trying to feel as well as possible. "I am Cacophonus, a discord, doctor of dissonance," roared the man, and as he spoke, several small explosions and a grinding crash were heard. "What does the A stand for?" stammered the nervous bug, too frightened to move. "As loud as possible," bellowed the doctor, and 2 screeches and a bump accompanied his response. "Now step a little closer and stick out your tongues." There's Cacophonous Foon facing forward. "Just as I suspected," he continued, opening a large dusty book and thumbing through the pages. "You're suffering from a severe lack of noise." He began to jump around the wagon, snatching bottles from shelves until he had a large assortment in various colors and sizes collected at one end of the table. All were neatly labeled. Loud cries, soft cries, bangs, bongs, smashes, crashes, swishes, swooshes, snaps, and crackles, whistles, and gongs, squeaks, squawks, and miscellaneous uproar. After pouring a little of each into a large glass beaker, he stirred the mixture thoroughly with a wooden spoon, watching intently as it smoked and steamed and boiled and bubbled. "Be ready in just a moment," he explained, rubbing his hands. Milo had never seen such unpleasant-looking medicine, and wasn't at all anxious to try any. "Well, just what kind of a doctor are you?" he asked suspiciously. "Well, you might say I'm a specialist," said the doctor. "I specialize in noise, all kinds, from the loudest to the softest, and from the slightly annoying to the terribly unpleasant. For instance, have you ever heard a square steam roller ride over a street full of hard-boiled eggs?" he asked. And as he did, all that could be heard were loud crunching sounds. "But who would want all those terrible noises?" asked Milo, holding his ears. "Everybody does," said the surprised doctor. "They're very popular today. Why, I'm kept so busy I can hardly fill the orders for noise pills, bracket lotion, clamor salve, and hubbub tonic. That's all people seem to want these days." He stirred the beaker of liquid a few more times, and then, as the steam cleared, continued. "Business wasn't always so good. Years ago, everyone wanted pleasant sounds, and except for a few orders during wars and earthquakes, things were very bad. But then, big cities were built, and there was a great need for honking horns, screeching trains, clanging bells, deafening shouts, piercing screeches, gurgling drains, and all the rest of those wonderfully unpleasant sounds we use so much of today. Without them, people would be very unhappy, so I make sure that they get as much as they want. Why, if you take a little of my medicine every day, you'll never have to hear a beautiful sound again. Here, try some." "If it's all the same to you, I'd rather not," said the humbug, backing away to the far corner of the wagon. "I don't want to be cured of beautiful sounds," insisted Milo. "Besides," growled Talk, who decided that he didn't much like Dr. Discord, "there is no such illness as lack of noise." "Of course not," replied the doctor, pouring himself a small glass of the liquid. That's what makes it so difficult to cure. I only treat illnesses that don't exist. That way, if I can't cure them, there's no harm done. Just one of the precautions of the trade," he concluded, and seeing that no one was about to take his medicine, he again reached toward the shelf, removed a dark amber bottle, dusted it carefully, and placed it on the table in front of him. "Very well. If you want to go all through life suffering from a noise deficiency, I'll give it all to Din for his lunch," he said, and he uncorked the bottle with a hollow-sounding pop. For a moment, everything was quiet as Milo, Talk, and the humbug looked intently at the bottle, wondering what Dr. Discord would do next. Then, very faintly, at first they heard a low rumbling that sounded miles away. It grew louder and louder and louder and closer, until it became deafening, ear-splitting roar that seemed to be coming from inside the tiny bottle. Then, from the bottle, a thick bluish smog spiraled to the ceiling, spread out, and gradually assumed the shape of a thick bluish smog with hands, feet, bright yellow eyes, and a large frowning mouth. As soon as the smog had completely gotten out of the bottle, it grasped the beaker of liquid, tilted back what would have been its head, if it really had one, and drank it all in 3 gulps. "Ah, that was good, master," he bellowed, shaking the whole wagon. "I thought you'd never let me out. Terribly cramped in there." "This is my assistant, the awful Din," said Dr. Discord. "You must forgive his appearance, for he doesn't really have any. You see, he is an orphan whom I raised myself without benefit of governess or any other assistance, for no nurse is good nurse," interrupted Din, doubling up with laughter. If you can imagine a thick bluish smog doubling up with laughter. Taking a sip of tea. Go ahead. Imagine. "For I found him," continued the doctor, ignoring this outburst, "living alone and unwanted in an abandoned soda bottle, without family or relatives." "No niece is good niece," roared Din again, with a laugh that sounded like several sirens going off at once, and he slapped at where his knee should have been. There he is. Slapping at his knee. I think he looks like such a jolly creature. "And brought him here," continued the exasperated Discord, "where despite his lack of shape or features, I trained—" "No nose is good nose," thundered Din once again as he collapsed in another fit of hysterics and clutched at his sides. "I trained him as my assistant in the business of concocting and dispensing noise," finished the doctor, mopping his brow with a handkerchief. "No noise is good noise," exclaimed Humbug happily, trying to catch the spirit of things. "That's not funny at all," sobbed Din, who went to a corner and sulked. "What is it, Din?" asked Milo, when he had recovered from the shock of seeing him appear. "You mean you've never met the awful Din before?" said Discord in a surprised tone. "Why, I thought everyone had. When you're playing in your room and making a great amount of noise, what did they tell you to stop?" "That awful Din," admitted Milo. "When the neighbors are playing their radio too loud late at night, what do you wish they'd turn down?" "That awful Din," answered Talk. When the street on your block is being repaired and the pneumatic drills are working all day, what does everyone complain of?" "The dreadful row," volunteered the humbug brightly. "The dreadful raw," cried the anguished Din, "was my grandfather. He perished in the great silence epidemic of 1712. Milo felt so sorry for the unhappy Din that he gave him his handkerchief, which was immediately covered in bluish, smoggy tears. "Thank you," groaned Din. "That's very kind. But I certainly can't understand why you don't like noise," he said. "Why, I heard an explosion last week that was so lovely. I cried for 2 days." The very thought of it upset him so much that he began to sob all over again in a way that sounded almost exactly like a handful of fingernails being scratched across a mile-long blackboard. He buried his head in the doctor's lap. "He's very sensitive, isn't he?" asked Milo, trying to comfort the emotional Din. "It's true," agreed Dr. Discord, "but he's right, you know, for noise is the most valuable thing in the world." "King Azaz says words are," said Milo. "Nonsense," the doctor roared. "Why, when a baby wants food, how does he ask?" "He screams," answered Din, looking up happily. "And when an automobile wants gas, it chokes," he shouted, jumping for joy. "When a river wants water, what does it do?" "It creaks," bellowed Din as he collapsed into fits of uncontrollable laughter. "And what happens when a new day begins?" "It breaks," he gasped joyfully from the floor, with a look of utter bliss covering his face. "You see how simple it is?" the doctor said to Milo, who didn't see it all. And then, turning to the tear-stained, smiling Din, he remarked, "Isn't it time for you to go?" "Where to?" asked Milo. "Perhaps we're going the same way." "I think not," the Din replied, picking up an armful of empty sacks from the table, "for I'm going on my noise collection rounds. You see, once a day I travel throughout the kingdom and collect all the wonderfully horrible and beautifully unpleasant noises that have been made, pack them into my sacks, and bring them back here for the doctor to make his medicines from." "And a good job he does," said Dr. Discord, pounding his fist on the table. "So wherever there is noise, that's where you'll find me," said the Din, with an appreciative smile. "And I must hurry along, for I understand that today there's to be a screech and several loud crashes and a bit of pandemonium." "And in which direction are you going?" asked the doctor, mixing another brew. "To Digitopolis," replied Milo. "How unfortunate," he said as the Din shuffled toward the door. "How very unfortunate, for then you must pass through the Valley of Sound." "Is that bad?" asked the perpetually worried humbug. The Din paused in the doorway with a look of extreme horror on his almost featureless face, and the doctor shuddered in a way that sounded very much like a fast-moving freight train being derailed into a mountain of custard. "Well, you might ask, for you will find out soon enough," was all he would say, as he sadly bade them farewell, and the Din galloped off his rounds. All right. I'm not going to leave on that cliffhanger. We are at 42 minutes. I'm going to go again because I think I can get this chapter done. And then we're going to call it good. And it feels good to do this again without interruptions. Yay! Maybe sometime if I have the will, I'll collect all the good bits and mix them together in like a full thing. I should try that. Anyway, Chapter 12, The Silent Valley. "How agreeable and pleasant this valley is," thought Milo, as once again they bounced along the highway, with the humbugs humming snatches of old songs to his own vast amusement, and Talk sniffing contentedly at the wind. I really can't see what Dr. Discord was so concerned about. There certainly couldn't be anything unpleasant along this road. And just as the thought crossed his mind, they passed through a heavy stone gateway, and everything was different. At first it was difficult to tell just what had changed. It all looked the same, it all smelled the same, but for some reason, nothing sounded the same. "I wonder what's happened," said Milo. At least that's what he tried to say, for although his lips moved, not a sound came from his mouth. And suddenly he realized what it was, for Talk was no longer ticking, and the humbug, although happily singing, was doing so in complete silence. The wind no longer rustled the leaves, the car no longer squeaked, the insects no longer buzzed in the fields. Not the slightest thing could be heard, and it felt as if, in some mysterious way, a switch had been thrown and all the sound in the world had been turned off at the same instant. The humbug, suddenly realizing what had happened, leapt to his feet in terror, and Talk worriedly checked to see if he was still keeping time. It was certainly a strange feeling to know that no matter how loudly or softly you chatted or rattled or bumped, it all came out the same way, as nothing. How dreadful, thought Milo as he slowed down the car. The three of them began to talk and shout at once, with absolutely no result, until, hardly noticing where they were going, they had driven into the midst of a large crowd of people marching along the road. Some of them were singing at the top of their non-existent voices, and others were carrying large signs which proclaimed, "Down with silence. All quiet is no diet. It's laudable to be audible. More sound for all." And one enormous banner simply stated, "Here, here." Except for these, and the big brass cannon being pulled along behind, they all looked very much like the residents of any other small valley to which you've never been. When the car had stopped, one of them held up a placard which said, "Welcome to the Valley of Sound," and the others cheered as loudly as possible, which was not very loud at all. "Have you come to help us?" asked another, stepping forward with his question. "Please," added a third. Milo tried desperately to say who he was and where he was going, but to no avail. As he did, 4 more placards announced, "Listen, scratch, look carefully, and we will tell you of our terrible misfortune." And while 2 of them held up a large blackboard, a third, writing as fast as he could, explained why there was nothing but quiet in the Valley of Sound. I'm going to take a cup of tea before I start this. Thanks, Temma. I'm glad to be back. "At a place in the valley, not far from here," he began, "where the echoes used to gather and the wind came to rest, there is a great stone fortress, and in it lives the Sound Keeper who rules this land. When the old King of Wisdom drove the demons into the distant mountains, he appointed her guardian of all sounds and noises, past, present, and future. For years she ruled as a wise and beloved monarch, each morning at sunrise releasing the day's new sounds to be borne by the winds throughout the kingdom, and each night at moonset gathering in the old sounds to be catalogued and filed in the vast storage vaults below." The writer paused for a moment to mop his brow, and then, since the blackboard was full, erased it completely and continued anew from the top. "She was generous to a fault, and provided us with all the sound we could possibly use, for singing as we worked, for bubbling pots of stew, for the chop of an axe and the crash of a tree, for the creak of a hinge and the hoot of an owl, for the squish of a shoe in the mud, and the friendly tapping of rain on the roof, for the sweet music of pipes and the sharp snap of winter ice cracking on the ground." He paused again as a tear of longing rolled from his cheek to lip with the salty sweet taste of an old memory. All these sounds, when once used, would be carefully placed in alphabetical order and neatly kept for future reference. Everyone lived in peace, and the valley flourished as the happy home of sound. But then things began to change. Slowly at first, and then in a rush, more people came to settle here, and brought with them new ways and new sounds, some very beautiful, some less so. But everyone was so busy with the things that had to be done that they scarcely had time to listen at all. And as you know, a sound which is not heard disappears forever and is not to be found again. People laughed less and grumbled more, sang less and shouted more. And the sounds they made grew louder and uglier. It became difficult to hear even the birds or the breeze, and soon everyone stopped listening for them. He again cleared the blackboard as the humbug choked back a sob and continued writing. The Sound Keeper grew worried and disconsolate. Each day there were fewer sounds to be collected, and most of those were hardly worth keeping. Many people thought it was the weather, and others blamed the moon, but the general consensus of opinion held that the trouble began at the time that rhyme and reason were banished. But No matter what the cause, no one knew what to do. Then one day, Dr. Discord appeared in the valley with his wagon of medicines and the bluish, smoggy din. He made a thorough examination and promised to cure everyone of everything, and the Soundkeeper let him try. He gave several bad-tasting spoonfuls of medicine to every adult and child, and it worked, but not really as expected, for he cured everybody of everything but noise. The Soundkeeper became furious. She chased him from the valley forever, and then issued the following decree. From this day forward, the Valley of Sound shall be silent. Since sound is no longer appreciated, I hereby abolish it. Please return all unused amounts to the fortress immediately. And that's the way it has been ever since, he concluded sadly. There's nothing we can do to change it, and each day new hardships are reported. A small man, with his arms full of letters and messages, pushed through the crowd and offered them to Milo. Milo took one, which read, Dear Soundkeeper, we had a thunderstorm last week, and the thunder still hasn't arrived. How long should we wait? Yours truly, a friend. Then he took a telegram which stated, Band concert great success. Stop. When may we expect the music? Stop. Now you see, continued the writer, why you must help us attack the fortress and free sound. What can I do? Wrote Milo. You must visit the Soundkeeper and bring from the fortress one sound, no matter how small, with which to load our cannon. For if we can reach the walls with the slightest noise, they will collapse and free the rest. It won't be easy, for she is hard to deceive, but you must try. Milo thought for a moment, and then, with a resolute, I shall, volunteered to go. Within a few moments, he stood bravely at the fortress door. Knock, knock, he wrote neatly on a piece of paper, which he pushed under the crack. In a moment, the great portal swung open, and, as it closed behind him, a gentle voice sang out, Right this way, I'm in the parlor. Can I talk now? Cried Milo happily, hearing his voice once again. Yes, but only in here, she replied softly. Now do, come into the parlor. Milo walked slowly down the long hallway and into the little room where the Soundkeeper sat listening intently to an enormous radio set, whose switches, dials, knobs, meters, and speaker covered one whole wall, and which at the moment was playing nothing. Isn't that lovely? She sighed. It's my favorite program, 15 minutes of silence. And after that, there's a half-hour of quiet, and then an interlude of lull. Why, did you know there are almost as many kinds of stillness as there are sounds? But sadly enough, no one pays any attention to them these days. Have you ever heard the wonderful silence just before dawn? She inquired. Or the calm and quiet just as the storm ends? Or perhaps you know the silence when you haven't the answer to a question you've been asked, or the hush of the country road at night, or the expectant pause in a room full of people when someone is just about to speak. Or, most beautiful of all, the moment after the door closes and you're all alone in the whole house. Each one is different, you know, all very beautiful, if you listen carefully. As she spoke, the thousands of little bells and chimes which covered her from head to toe tinkled softly, and, as if in reply, the telephone began to ring too. For someone who loves silence, she certainly talks a great deal, thought Milo. At one time I was able to listen to any sound made any place at any time, the Soundkeeper remarked, pointing toward the radio wall. But now I merely... Pardon me, interrupted Milo as the phone continued to ring. But aren't you going to answer it? Oh no, not in the middle of a program, she replied, and turned the silence up a little louder. But it may be important, insisted Milo. Not at all, she assured him. It's only me. It gets so lonely around here, with no sounds to distribute or collect, that I call myself 7 or 8 times a day, just to see how I am. How are you? He asked politely. Not very well, I'm afraid. I seem to have a touch of static, she complained. But what brings you here? Of course, you've come to tour the vaults. Well, they're usually only open to the public on Mondays from 2 to 4, but since you've traveled so far, we'll have to make an exception. Follow me, please. She quickly bounced to her feet with a chorus of jingles and chimes and started down the hallway. Don't you just love jingles and chimes? I do, she answered quickly. Besides, they're very convenient, for I'm always getting lost in this big fortress, and all I have to do is listen for them, and I know exactly where I am. They entered a tiny cage-like elevator and traveled down for fully 3/4 of a minute, stopping finally in an immense vault whose long lines of file drawers and storage bins stretched in all directions from where here they began to where there they ended, and from floor to ceiling. Every sound that's ever been made in history is kept here, said the soundkeeper, skipping down one of the corridors with Milo in hand. For instance, look here. She opened one of the drawers and pulled out a small brown envelope. This is the exact tune George Washington whistled when he crossed the Delaware on that icy night in 1777. Milo peered into the envelope, and sure enough, that's exactly what was in it. But why do you collect them all? He asked as she closed the drawer. If we didn't collect them, said the soundkeeper, as they continued to stroll through the vault, the air would be full of old sounds and noises, bouncing around and bumping into things. It would be terribly confusing, for you'd never know whether you were listening to an old one or a new one. Besides, I do like to collect things, and there are more sounds than almost anything else. Why, I have everything here, from the buzz of a mosquito 1,000,000 years ago to what your mother said to you this morning. And if you come back here in 2 days, I'll tell you what she said tomorrow. It's really very simple. Let me show you. Say a word. Any word.
Hello, said Milo, for it was all he could think of.
Now where do you think it went? She asked with a smile. I don't know, said Milo, shrugging his shoulders. I always thought that most people do, she hummed, peering down one of the corridors. Now let me see. First we find the cabinet with today's sounds. Here it is. Then we look under G for greetings, then M for Milo, and here it is already in its envelope. So you see, the whole system is quite automatic. It's a shame we hardly use it anymore. That's wonderful, gasped Milo. May I have one little sound as a souvenir? Certainly, she said with pride, and then immediately thinking better of it, added, not. And don't try to take one, because it's strictly against the rules. Milo was crestfallen. He had no idea how to steal a sound, even the smallest one, for the soundkeeper always had at least one eye focused on him. Now for a look at the workshop, she cried, whisking him through another door and into a large abandoned laboratory full of old pieces of equipment, all untended and rusting. This is where we used to invent the sounds, she said wistfully. Do they have to be invented? Asked Milo, who seemed surprised at almost everything she told him. I thought they just were. No one realizes how much trouble we go through to make them, she complained. Why, at one time this shop was crowded and busy from morning to night. How do you invent a sound? Milo inquired. Oh, that's very easy, she said. For each sound has its own exact shape and size. Then you make some of them here in the shop and grind each one 3 times into an invisible powder and throw a little of it each into the air every time you need it. But I've never seen a sound, insisted Milo. You've never seen them out there, she said, waving her arm in the general direction of everywhere. Except every once in a while on a very cold morning when they freeze. But in here, we see them all the time. Here, let me show you. She picked up a padded stick and struck a nearby bass drum 6 times. 6 large, woolly, fluffy cotton balls, each about 2 feet across, rolled silently out onto the floor. You see, she said, putting some of them into a large grinder. Now listen. And she took a pinch of the invisible powder and threw it into the air with a boom, 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 boom. Do you know what a hand clap looks like? Milo shook his head. Try it, she commanded. He clapped his hands once, and a single sheet of clean white paper fluttered to the floor. He tried it 3 more times, and 3 more sheets of paper did the very same thing. And then he applauded as fast as he could, and a great cascade of papers filled the air. Isn't that simple? And it's all the same for all sounds. If you think about it, you'll soon know what one looks like. Take laughter, for instance, she said, laughing brightly, and 1,000 tiny, brightly colored bubbles flew into the air and popped noiselessly. Or speech, she continued. Some of it is light and airy, some sharp and pointed, but most of it, I'm afraid, is just heavy and dull. How about music? Asked Milo excitedly. Right over here, we weave it on our looms. Symphonies are the large, beautiful carpets with all the rhythms and melodies woven in. Concertos are these tapestries, and all the other bolts of cloth are serenades, waltzes, overtures, and rhapsodies. And we also have some of the songs that you often sing, she cried, holding up a handful of brightly colored handkerchiefs. She stopped for a moment and said sadly, We even had one section over there that did nothing but put the sound of ocean into seashells. This was once such a happy place. Then why don't you make sound for everyone now? He shouted so eagerly that the soundkeeper leaped back in surprise. Don't shout so, young man. If there's one thing we need more of around here, it's less noise. Now come with me and I'll tell you all about it. And put that down. Immediately. Her last remark was directed toward Milo's efforts to stuff one of the large drum beats into his back pocket. They returned quickly to the parlor when the soundkeeper had settled herself into a chair and carefully turned the radio to a special hour of hush. Milo asked his question once again and in a somewhat lower voice. It doesn't make me happy to hold back the sounds, she began softly, for if we listen to them carefully, they can sometimes tell us things far better than words. But if that is so, asked Milo, and he had no doubt that it was, shouldn't you release them? Never, she cried. They just use them to make horrible noises, which are ugly to see and worse to hear. I leave all that to Dr. Discord and that awful, awful din. But some noises are good sounds, aren't they? He insisted. That may be true, she replied stubbornly. But if they won't make the sounds that I like, they won't make any. But he started to say, and it got no further than that. For while he was about to say that he didn't think that was quite fair, a thought to which the obstinate soundkeeper might not have taken kindly, he suddenly discovered the way he would carry his little sound from the fortress. In the instant between saying the word and before it sailed off into the air, he clamped his lips shut, and the butt was trapped in his mouth, all made but not spoken. Well, I mustn't keep you all day, she said impatiently. Now turn out your pocket so that I can see you didn't steal anything and you can be on your way. When he had satisfied the soundkeeper, he nodded his farewell, for it would have been most impractical to say thank you or good afternoon, and raced out the door. And we shall see what happens with that butt he has captured in his mouth on Thursday, where I will be coming from you live again here on my YouTube channel. And thanks for being patient and thanks for watching. And stay safe out there. Okay. Love you. Bye.